Welcome to Divcasts from the University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Well, it's going to be a pleasure to hear our discussions after these three thoughtful papers that illuminated so many issues in both Maimonides and the translation by Shlomo. And I would like to just mention a word about format, that we'll start off with the panelists addressing the questions to one another. And if after about... is this microphone on? Can you all hear me? The microphone is not on. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you. So, if the three panelists could carry on the discussion for about a half hour or so, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And when the audience asks questions, I would only suggest that each person begin by asking one question. We may get around to where we can have more questions, but to make sure that everyone gets a chance, I'd suggest that as a format. And I won't be here trying to mediate questions, so the questions can be posed directly to one of the three panelists or in a general fashion. So with that, why don't we just turn it over to you three and let you begin discussing some of the issues, and then we'll come in as it seems appropriate. Do you want me to suggest someone to start, or shall I?
I can start.
Okay.
With these questions. Very much enjoying both thoughts. And hello? Hello? I very much enjoyed both talks, and despite what Sarah said about overlap, I think all three talks, or at least the other two talks, went very well together, and probably all three talks went well together. I'd like to ask a question of Alfred about, he made some very interesting points about how to read the Penis translation, which don't always occur to one, perhaps unless they're really very carefully comparing the Arabic text with the translation and seeing what's missing, what's not. But in two of the examples you gave, you used the translation that Penis uses for infial, as passion, and the translation in another passage, Adam, as non-existence. But the usual translation for penis of infial is affect or affection, as you were expecting it to be here in your comments. And in that passion, as in the passage you made. And also for Adam, penis frequently translates it as privation. Although here it's non-existence and occasionally it's non-being. And I was wondering to what extent the importance of the passages you suggested can really be appreciated without making a thorough study of every time the term appears in the guide and whether this is something special about these passages here, or maybe it was one of those places where Penis, for the moment, wasn't thinking about how he translated it in other places, or was something special about these passages that led him to translate it not as he translated the term in other passages. And also with regard to discussion of his use of terms and the way he's translating certain terms, perhaps to make them more appealing to a general reader than Maimonides would do. If you have any comments on his usual translation, or maybe his unusual translation of Huduth as created in time, every time, and also Muhtah, as created in time, or creation in time for Huduth.
Yeah. Well, I did once hope that I hoped somebody would have prepared an index of every time Maimonides used every word and made word counts so we can easily check to see that we're not taking an anomalous expression or anomalous translation. I didn't do that. I went through the whole guide in the past few years in anticipation of writing a commentary, and one of the things that stood out to me as unusual in the translation, and on the basis of that I wrote the paper. So although I agree with Sarah and you that there's a wonderful regularity in the Penis translation of technical terms, there are these times when he deviates from that, and where he says he uses the odd translation, which I thought would have particular significance. So, and I tried to illustrate that in the talk, showing that he uses Ivry as passion when it could have been a little less toned down there. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't use it directly elsewhere. So explain that as deliberate, these terms being deliberate, these usages. Treating Huduth as creation in time, he does do that, but I thought it interesting that he felt obliged to use the term Mubdi as creator of creation in the terms of creatio ex nihilo, where that isn't necessarily the case, but he wants to push it in that direction to fortify Maimonides' presumed view of that as creation from nothing. But that is not necessarily there, and Maimonides knew it. It's not always used that way. Penis tried to push it that way because he thought that was Maimonides' intention to present it that way to the reader.
If I may latch on to this discussion, just to point out that we have, all three of us have remarked on the issue of terminological translations in Penis, but I think the tendency is not just ours, but the tendency is to fix our view or to focus on words. Whereas I think that for Penis, the regular, consistent translation went beyond the words and the terminology. And I noticed in preparing for this conference, I went to look at Andres and Kuta's lexicon and noticed that in the introduction they include in the lexicon also the syntax. And I think that when we look for the consistency in Penis, it's important to see not just the terms, but also the turn of phrases and the way he translates them. If there's a consistency there, and you actually, Professor Ivry, in your talk, you also pointed to this turn of phrases that he sometimes chooses instead of just choosing a word for a word. And I think that can actually tell us to what extent he is consistent or simply rigid. For example, another point is that he does not always choose the same word for the same Arabic word. In the lexicon, in the index that he gives in the end, adraka has usually apprehended, but sometimes it's grasp. And I admitted I didn't go to look at all the places where he chooses grasp instead of apprehended, but I think the syntax and the context are here very important.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, and I think part of Alfred's point is that within the syntax, in some cases that he outlined, Penis even goes beyond that by throwing in words that I don't think one would get from syntax necessarily, but that end up giving it a much more personal meaning, like with regard to the watching over of providence, where the only term, the verb seems to be missing, but the only term is the providence. And now he watches over the providence. So that I thought was quite, I wouldn't say alarming, but it was a very good example of some change which is going on. And whether it's happening just in this discussion of providence or happens consistently is another question.
It is consistent. Yes, he is consistent in interpreting it that way. That I did notice. What do you make of the Shekhinah being interpreted as the indwelling? That puzzled me greatly. Trying to figure that out when you talk. I don't know what to do. Does it occur? Does that term indwelling occur before Venus?
Yeah.
In translation or something? Or is that used?
I would have thought it was a 19th century term for the Shekhinah.
Standard rabbinic interpretation.
Yeah.
Who does?
I think it's a standard translation of the rabbinic term.
So he was using
that.
He was using that.
Yeah, I don't have the source in front of me, but
I think it's probably taking the noun from the verb, shachanti betocham. So this is, I think this is just...
Isn't it from like being in a neighborhood? That like you're in a place, that's where the indwelling is, shachin, yeah.
It comes from the verse, shachanti betocham, and I will dwell within them.
But it's such a strange usage, such an unfamiliar term to use in this context.
I think it's sometimes translated as presence. I'm trying to remember the basic text. I mean, it's the in indwelling, which is very confusing. It's sure it comes from Shachanti, which is I will dwell. And I don't know where they got the indwelling.
It's like inherence, getting here.
Sometimes used to translate the Arabic term hulul, but this has negative theological overtones for Muslim
That's
mind.
right.
If I can ask the two of you a more general question, which I think comes from comes out of all three papers. This is a conference in honor of Primus's translation, but we think none of us want to turn it into a hagiography. And I think the issues that I'd like to hear your opinion about is what is the purpose of a translation? What is the purpose of a translation of a philosophical text? Do we, of that kind, do we expect the readers to be able to read the Arabic the way you do and compare it? Is the translation mostly a commentary? Do we expect the translation to be a kind of a bait that will get the reader to learn Arabic and get to the original? Or is the purpose of a translation the buzzword of accessibility, to get them to make the text more accessible? And to whom?
Here, I think the comparison with the Monk translation is wonderful, because Monk has a very fine translation also, but in addition, Monk's translation is also a commentary with copious notes. The notes are on a very high level, a lot of Greek and Latin without translation. So it's not, doesn't popularize the text, but he makes it much more accessible in that he gives notes together with the translation. Now that brings us back to what was the purpose of doing a translation of a difficult text without supplying a commentary. That's really defeating the purpose of accessibility if it's a difficult text. So I would say, to answer your question, that a good translation should be loyal to the author. If the author wanted to make it difficult, he's entitled. The translation shouldn't go over that budget and freely translate it so it's to be something else. But at the same time, we should allow the reader to understand the subtlety or the possible subtleties in the commentary. So a good translation needs a commentary. That's what I would say.
Well, what's interesting, I think, what Sarah said about why there are notes in it, that the public, the external, the Dahir, is that the press said there was no money to put in these excessive notes, and maybe somebody could say they were worried the text would never appear. Extra years were taken writing the notes. But then the bottom is, the inner meaning is that it's probably best for a text like the guide to not try to spell out things except where absolutely necessary, and to keep the comments to a minimum. So the reader has to think and try to interpret the text for himself. One could, and also, because with the notes, this is part of Sarah's question, and I think also your response, the notes become the notes of the annotator, and they really become, in some cases, however great a scholar the annotator might be, they're enforcing his own interpretation of the guide into the notes, unless he says that there are different ways of interpreting this, such as A, B, and C, and then it really gets... so we may have somebody who reads the discussion of creation out of nothing, or not from anything in the guide, and says, well, Maimonides says, what's our view on creation? And in the note, the person will say, well, we can see here from this discussion and what Maimonides literally says, that the world is created or something like that, not from anything. And then somebody else writing notes to the same passage will say, yes, but if you compare this discussion with the discussion in another chapter, it becomes pretty clear that Maimonides' true understanding was that the world is created out of eternal matter. And then somebody else reading it will say, well, maybe that fellow's on the right track. But the true meaning of Maimonides is that the world is eternal. So 3 scholars would be giving 3 different explanations to a fundamental, and these are represented by scholars today, to a fundamental teaching in Maimonides. And unless they put forward the various possibilities, or just say, my interpretation is, it suddenly becomes the author, or the commentator, the translator enforcing his own views on the reader, which will vary from who the commentator happens to be. It's really, the example I'm giving is a very broad, extreme example. Obviously, in some cases, we would like more notes just to help us understand what the sentence is really saying and how it should be interpreted. But I think it's, for a text like The Guide of the Perplexed, he certainly doesn't want art scroll type of comments or paraphrase.
So I think Michael Schwartz did a wonderful translation in Hebrew, I think. And there he solved the problem, because he gave copious references in the notes to articles discussing each and every issue, each and every line practically. It's a very exhaustive commentary without pushing any one particular view, I think.
Yeah, no, that was very important.
So that would be a model kind of translation to offer.
And it kind of needs an update every few years to fill in the bill. But that's for a really serious scholar, and it's extremely important, I think. I could say, has anybody investigated this problem, this question? Who has done it? And all of a sudden, Michael Schwartz in his notes, at the beginning of every chapter says, oh, here are the various articles written on this topic and on this thing, and compare them. That's a little bit different than long annotated notes.
I would like to push a little bit with my question, because the idea of the notes, I think the letter that Kramer and Stern published also mentions the idea of the notes, and it was there, and for whatever reason it disappeared. But the notes are a question apart. The translation itself, we know that Maimonides, in the introduction, when he speaks about the text, he speaks about his audience, and he says, I'm the one who prefers to please 1 out of 10,000. Is the audience of the translation the same? A translator or penis, or the person who thinks whether penis should be supplemented by another or exchange for another translation. Is the audience, do we think of the audience of a translation of the guide as the same audience as Maimonides thought of when he wrote the guide? Or is it a different audience?
Yeah, that's really a very important question. When I look at it, I think of Chantal Falacera and his commentary, one of the first, not the first, but he probably thought it was the first commentary on the guide. How can one write a commentary on the Guide of the Perplexed when Maimonides seems to warn the reader explicitly not to write a public commentary on the Guide of the Perplexed? So Falacera, I believe, thought he was able to get around that problem by doing something a little bit closer to what Michael Schwartz did, or at least to be able to say, these are the sources that seem to have influenced Maimonides in these various chapters. And not only that, to translate them and to bring them in front of the reader, who probably didn't know Arabic anyway. And I think for Falacera, he didn't see his audience in his commentary on the guide as 1 in 10,000, but I think he saw it, he still distinguished between the few and the many, but the Jahil for him was a much smaller percentage than it seemed to be for Maimonides. I think he felt there were many more people who could benefit from the Guide to Perplexed, and as he saw it, it's probably more the way I suspect most of us see it. It may not be 1 in 10,000. Maybe 1 in 10,000 who really understands the guide, but it's not for these commentators 1 in 10,000 who can really benefit from such a book. But anything that can be, things that can be done to make it more accessible, can be useful. I think that's what Falakera was doing. But to take it to beyond that, and I think many of Monk's notes, which is very hard to read a chapter of the guide without Monk, are also explaining not what necessarily Maimonides is trying to say, but the sense of a passage, how the passage fits together, what the term is, and how other people have translated the term, in particular Ibn Tibon. So my own feeling is that people who are writing comments today, people who are writing articles on Maimonides, probably still should be a little bit prudent. I mean, I think that's what Stroumsa was trying to claim, and know what the audience is. But I don't think most people see it as 1 in 10,000. It's trying to give hints for an intelligent person who may be able to begin to understand the text.
What is the prudence all about? What is the great secret that Strauss and Maimonides and Penis wanted to keep from being too explicit about? It would be to demolish the Jewish community's belief in Maimonides as the great name in Jewish history. It would marginalize him in terms of fidelity to the people. So they felt, I think for that reason, it politically prudent not to comment more than necessary. What do you think of that?
Yeah, but I think it's not just Maimonides' name is the great ego. It's also the great ego understood Judaism in this way. Then that might very well be what the truth is. And certainly Bar-Ilan on different occasions one fairly reasonably had a student come up almost in tears and saying, did Maimonides really not believe in the resurrection of the dead? And looked at the person and said, well, I guess scholars disagree about that, but Maimonides certainly says in the Epistle of the Resurrection of the Dead, read my lips, I believe in the resurrection of the dead. So I suggest that's what we should do. And then the person walks away happy. So occasionally it is a very practical manner that goes beyond. I mean, you're certainly right. How do we look at the great ego, depending on our interpretation? But if Maimonides feels this way, it also has some influence even today. People might view the basic principles of Judaism.
That's what they thought.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we move out of the Jewish community, the translation into English as opposed to the translation into Hebrew reaches out to people who don't have that kind of problem. And if we think of the undergraduate class where chapters of Maimonides are taught or read, and where we hope the student will continue to read in a graduate seminar also Maimonides, would you say that for that kind of class you would have preferred a more explicit translation rather than the way that Penis took?
No.
That's what I thought.
Ken?
Yeah, let me follow up on Sarah's point, because I think it's valid.
we teach Maimonides at secular universities throughout the Western world. Undergraduates read various passages, graduate students read sometimes the whole book. The University of Chicago is a secular press. There was nothing like this in Maimonides. And so the audience for the translation is very different from the audience of the original text. I mean, I don't know that Maimonides ever could even have imagined what the readership for his text that we take for granted with our students. So it is a very different context.
And
I take it that's your point. I think this is
and what I'm trying, and I thank you for putting it so clearly, what I'm trying to say is, I guess, is that all three of us in different ways are saying that even, and yet, yes, this is true, this is not the audience that Maimonides would have imagined, and yet we still think, or so it seems, that one does not want to make a diluted version of Maimonides that would make life, not because of religious reasons, not because of the religious reason for the esotericism, but because this is Maimonides. You don't want to dilute it and to present something that is accessible and easy and readable, and then all the complications that Maimonides was struggling with would disappear.
You know, I mean, I think the real virtue of this translation is that it does a very good job of doing both, of making it accessible and yet as much as could be expected true to the original. That's really the challenge.
I'd like to, as a way of starting to think a little bit more about your question, who his readers are and who he had in mind. It seems, from what he says, that he had a Jewish reader in mind who studied some science, not a
Maimonides,
not an experienced philosopher who's mastered physics, but somebody who's beginning to study and is perplexed. But even in his own day, or a century later, the text was being read by Muslims and Christians. It was being read by Christians in Arabic, and then it was translated almost immediately into, next century, into Latin, which means Christians were reading it. But when Maimonides, like most of the Jewish authors, wrote his text, the biblical statements, biblical quotes, and rabbinic teachings were not translated. They were right there, which I always thought would have been a tremendous stumbling block for the Muslim reader. Do you just skip over those passages and continue reading, or what? Until I read Gregory's article on the Christian Arabs who read the Guide of the Perplexed. And suddenly it didn't seem that this was a problem. They would consult and they would find out what's there, and then they would make the effort and read the text and benefit from it. And of course the Christians just had in the West just had the Latin translation of it. So was Maimonides trying to keep the guide in part from the Muslim reader for whatever reason, because he was focusing on the Jewish reader? Would he have been happy to hear about the Latin translation of the guide into for the scholastics? And who would the readership have been there? Maybe somebody has some thoughts on that.
Well, Maimonides thought that he wrote it particularly in Judeo-Arabic to avoid I can't second guess Maimonides, but I, like a good Jew, I respond with a question. That's Maimonides' audience or intended audience. what is Penis's intended audience? Who were the people that Penis was thinking about? Because he certainly did not think only of the student Barilan who comes to you in tears.
Right.
He probably had.
Well,
Can we open up the discussion later now?
yeah, sure.
With the boss.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Well, I noticed there's a tough guy in between the two of you. He's asked a couple of tough questions there that we're sort of not listening to on this. But in the passages that Alfred cited with his translation of watching over, is it Inanna? We're talking about Inanna.
That's the noun. There is no verb. The noun is there. Oh, sorry.
No, I meant Inanna. The notion of providence.
Yes, the property is not the verb.
Okay, but the sense of Inanna is there.
Yes.
The sense of Inanna for almost everyone goes back to Alexander, which has it that God has no primary intentionality whatsoever for the world. And the parable stresses this very much, that God does not know anything outside of God's own self. So the translation here would be up to the reader, in a sense. And the informed reader will know that there's no God watching over as if that's a
The meaning would be up to the
particular, yes, I mean, there's no particular intentionality by God with regard to any individuals on the philosophical account. And this goes back to what Sarah was talking about too. You term it mode, it's removed in a sense, but it's also a kind of thoroughgoing two-sided cognitive dissonance in Maimonides. That will take the scientific side, and the scientific reader would never think that God's watching over us except metaphorically. But other readers, if we want to embrace the religious tradition, part of the cognitive dissonance, will think of it as meaning God is watching over us.
Yes. Yes, my point was that Aquinas deliberately wanted it popular, thinking that a person who knows better will know better. But in the meantime, the other reader will be contented to read what he reads.
But I think what one of the things Richard was saying is that maybe providence itself isn't even necessarily the correct translation here. But I don't really see how you can have any other term. I mean, pronoia, as far as I know, doesn't appear in Aristotle's account in the physics, but Alexander puts it in, and Averroes puts it in his long commentary. And they put it in the context of trying to understand what it means to speak of a final cause, and even drawing Aristotle out. I think Averroes for a different audience than Alexander. And I think if you were to ask Averroes, how should we translate this term here? He would say providence would be the best English translation.
And let the reader, the person you're addressing, determine for him or herself the content of it.
I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. This is what I meant before when I said that we have to translate not only the terms but also the syntax. And this may be a good example of that. Because the text says, وَتَكُونُ عِنَايَةُ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى دَائِمًا بِمَنْ حَصَلَ لَهُ ذَلِكَ الْفَيْض. And the Arabic text seems to imply a verb. I think that this is what Pinus is doing here. It's not وَتَكُونُ هُنَاكَ عِنَايَةُ اللَّهِ تَكُونُ عِنَايَةُ اللَّهِ what? بِمَنْ حَصَلَ. And I think that he's trying, the inayah seems to be a working thing, not just a noun sitting there. And I think that this is what Pinus is trying to do. He's trying to translate also the syntax, not just the term.
But you could say provide, you don't have to say watch over.
You could say provide, but you need a verb. I think that whatever you do, you would need a verb. You couldn't translate this text word for word without providing the verb. Now, you're right, you could have said something that would sound less caring and less personal. But I think that Penis is trying also to translate the syntax. And I think it would be important to see if he's constant in that too.
But it could be just exercising problem.
So, let me suggest perhaps a different angle. Let me suggest perhaps a different angle. I'd like to know what you think. We have the case of the difficult text. Why translate the difficult text? Why is it necessary? Why is it good? If we see the 1963 edition as a whole, we also have to include Stroumsa's introduction and the joint project. And Strauss, let's not forget, he republished his essay, Liberalism, Ancient and Modern, where he grouped Maimonides together with Plato and Lucilius and Lucretius as an example of classical critical philosophy. So perhaps the intention here, perhaps, is more radical insofar as when in our context we don't make a text immediately clear to human intellect, which is part of our enlightenment tradition. But instead, we make the text difficult. Then the text, a translation of this kind is intended to move us, a translation of this kind into English especially, is intended perhaps to move us to think critically about humanity, about the enlightenment. And if that's the case, then there's a whole separate question that arises. Is this being loyal to Maimonides' intention? Do we have to translate his context into our context? What is our parallel to his case? Or perhaps that entire project is mistaken.
I'll venture above the head answer. I think this needs to be checked. It's an interesting idea, but my top of the head answer would be that probably there was a different purpose for Strauss and for Penis. Although at this particular conjunction they worked together, there were many things on which they saw together, but the agenda, and you can see it over the years, was different. That's my impression. Yeah, I think in many ways Penis's translation, the audience that Penis was aiming at was scholars of Islam, scholars of medieval philosophy, scholars of Jewish philosophy. I mean, this different audience, I think, in some ways.
Would Strauss have attached to his introductory essay if that was the intended audience?
Well, I think at this particular time it worked. They found themselves in the same place. But that's just my I guess.
Jeff, did you want to say?
I wanted to go back to what you were talking about, maybe a little bit before that question. But I wanted to begin in a way by asking you, Alfred, if you would say that all of the examples, while you would agree that in general Penis showed great fidelity to the original text, all of the examples that you found, this kind of what should we call it, expansion on the text, seem to go in the direction of putting something of a bit more of traditional language into whatever it is that he was having in his translation. Which, if that was the case, that in a way would give the response to Sarah that I'm not sure that you've given yet, but it seems to me would be implied there that he saw the audience for his translation, his first translation, as being, at least in part, an audience that he didn't want to. Well, maybe it's not necessarily the case that's his only audience, but he didn't want to upset more than necessary, shall we say. That there was fidelity to the text, but still in certain places he put in his translation things that, as maybe he assumed Maimonides would have done, that would maybe not as quite as strongly as you did with your student about the resurrection of the dead, but that would be less upsetting, shall we put it. And if that's the case, if that's what you would answer, actually, I wanted to just tie this in with Sarah, because that would seem to be a further support that even in the guide itself, he has made a strong distinction between the translation he was writing and the introduction he was writing. Because the introduction could have been much more upsetting if one read it very closely than the kind of additions that it seems to me that you're saying he chose to make when he expanded a little bit here and there on the text. Although maybe you have examples of expansions that went in a different direction and not just in the, how should we put it, more comforting direction.
I don't think the person who read the introduction, his introduction, would have picked up a more critical attitude. I think
would you repeat that, please?
I think Jeff is saying that the introduction that Venus wrote to his translation shows a more critical attitude than he presents in the translation itself, according to my reading of the translation. But I'm not sure that I agree with you. I'd have to hear your paper, in which you point that out, to be persuaded of that. The introduction he writes is very informative. It does help the reader orient to the whole field very nicely and to see possible leads that could have led Maimonides to more radical understanding. That's true, but not necessarily. So it's a guarded introduction also, I think. Joseph.
I have a few comments. One, just as the story, when you said history, say a bit about the history of that article that Craig and I wrote in the commentary. I remember something I wasn't told about this in that note. The way that note came about is that sometime before Venus died, I was told that he'd written a commentary on the guide, which was not published, it was the translation. And I must have told a few people, including Zeph Harvey, but then after Venus died, Zeph contacted me and asked, said that he and started going to the library, did not find this commentary, and asked me whether I could find out what happened to it, or told me that there had been this commentary. And I asked everyone in the world that I could possibly imagine, including Alfred, who said that they had been told that there weren't funds to finance it. He said that wouldn't have been true because there were donors, so that wouldn't have been a problem. And in the end, I could find no one who knew anything about the commentary, where it told me anything. So I went back to Zeb. I'm sure that somebody told me this, but I actually don't know who it is. A couple of years later, Alfred and I were at a conference at NYU. Somehow the topic came up, and Alfred said to me, "I told you. You told me." Okay. So I rushed back to Chicago, excited. I called the press. I asked them, "Can I look at the notes, the manuscript, the box where you have the translation, to see whether there's a commentary in it, or any evidence of a commentary?" And they said, "No. It's in a warehouse. We're just applying now for an archivist. He'll start from the most recent books, 20 years, and you can that box." And I said, "Can we go in and just find the box?" He said, "No, we want to put them in there." So after at that point, Kramer and I had spoken on a number of occasions about going to look at these Strauss archives during special collections. We decided we would go look there and see if there was any evidence there of the translation, of the commentary. And there was none, but we found instead these, the letters that we published, right, which were only Penis' letters to Strauss. I then went back to Jerusalem, and I was in touch with Uri Penis at that time, and I tried to find out what happened to Strauss' letters to Penis. And Uri Penis then told me that Strauss, that Penis destroyed generally correspondence, and he destroyed many manuscripts. There was a novel apparently written. He told Uri Penis to read it after his death, showed him where it was locked in some sort of road box, and after he died, we went to open the box to read the novel, and it no longer was there. He apparently had destroyed it. So the only conclusion we could come to was that there were three possibilities for what happened, for what the reality of this commentary was. One was that there was a planned commentary and it was turned instead into the introduction, transcribed introduction. That originally was meant to be in some way, in the term format, obviously, a commentary. But that's what survives of the planned commentary. The second alternative is that he actually had written this and like these other things he destroyed the commentary. Okay. The third possibility, which I think is in some ways the most likely, is that a number of people told me, and I think Peter's also once told me, with respect to some topic, was that they raised a topic with them, and he said, I have an article on this. And then the article was never found. And what seems to be the case is that Peter wrote these articles in his head. I mean, he didn't put them on paper, put them on paper, and this is especially true of a lot of the later essays. They really are, if you read them, the first drafts, they're just to be put down what he'd been thinking about, right? He didn't really revise them. So it's very possible that when he talked about this commentary to you, he actually had a commentary in his head. From his point of view, the commentary was that it was complete. It simply had to be transcribed. Small job. Okay. And that's where, and that would be an explanation of why this actually found the transcription, because it died with the penis in his head. So those are, I think, the options for the fate of this commentary. And you read it, that's great.
Two footnotes on that. The first is that, as I recall your article, what we have to go and see, I think it appears there that from the correspondence itself, it appears that there is a discussion of two sets of notes.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
So it's actually the proof for the thing being thought about is already in the text. But I think you're right in saying that Penis had a way of writing things first in his head and then putting them on paper. Among all the things that we did find in looking through his papers, there were no drafts. There were handwritten materials and typed material, but they were the same. Of course, it's possible that there were drafts that he threw away or destroyed, but there were lots of drafts in the sense that there are handwritten articles of the same thing, that then there is a typed version and then the text itself.
Can I just make I want to ask one question. I just want to make one observation about the issue about the choice of the translation. It was more personal translation for United and watching over the Bible and so on. There's a lecture that newspaper started to translate. I mean, it's actually, this was an example. I mean, one day Uri Penis called me excitedly and said, I found something, come over and look at it. And he brought out a plastic sake bag, which had the 1955 lecture in it. And it was still, this was a lecture which he given during the year with Stroumsa, and let me talk about this a little bit in my talk. And it was still rolled up, and the top page was the page where he ended the lecture. Okay, it was an unfinished lecture. Okay, and then Stroumsa published the lecture in the U. It's actually the last entry in the official bibliography of the Society site. In that article, he makes a very interesting distinction. He argues that Maimonides seems to have applied the negative theology, all this things about negative theology, to biblical language for God. And none of those expressions should be taken, okay, in their affirmative meaning, corporeal meaning, okay, and that's, Torah speaks of the language of the Son of Man, okay, and they should all be interpreted in some sort of negative form. And he observes that when it comes to philosophers' language for God, for example, we've got the formal clause, the final clause, the description of God in 168, there's no attempt at all to apply the theory of negative theology. Okay? So it's possible that in choosing the language that he did, all right, for these subjects like providence, he adopted a biblical mode of expression, specifically, all right, Venus that is, all right, translating these terms, on the assumption that Maimonides' intention would have been, and the knowing reader would have known, those are not to be taken in their affirmative, in their personal, okay, corporeal, anthropomorphic meaning at all. You apply the theory of the negative theology to that, all right, and then get something much more, abstract and philosophically kosher. So maybe that's partly an explanation about why, because I find it hard to understand why Venus would want to have Maimonides present a personal God, right? Unless his intention really was to emulate sort of the biblical, what he thought was Maimonides' approach to biblical language, right? Which would be reinterpreted. The question I just wanted to ask you is, what's one translation which is I think it's puzzled a lot of people, is the translation of, these are not deep into creation in time. Because that's the idea of adding in time. He emphasizes again that time itself was created. And surely that's not in the Arabic. I mean, why did he insisted add that qualification, created in time? Do we need to have an explanation for that?
Davidson also raises this question.
Pardon?
Davidson also raises this question in his book and says that it's ridiculous.
By the way, I'll ask Kramer about that loose. He wouldn't be very happy with that. I think we'll all together take this.
Free pleasure, by the way, translates it as creation simplicator. That's right. Creation in the beginning and creation ex nihilo, the same word, the same paragraph translated frequently.
Ray, do you want to say something?
I wanted it has to do with that question and also with your comment. I wonder about the term Adam. You point out that it's translated differently, privation and non-existence. And I wonder in the first place about the elementary meaning that you say is privation, and how certain that meaning is. At least my impression is that when I hear the term privation, forgetting about Adam, that it's related to the Aristotelian notion of habit and privation. And it's become a rather technical term. And to move from the English term privation back to Adam, I wonder if that's perfectly clear. I just don't know. And with respect to whether it should be translated as privation or non-existence, is it possible that somehow the term for Maimonides could, in some sense, encompass both meanings, or perhaps that he just wants to use it to allude in one place to one thing and to something else someplace else, especially since this is such a loaded issue. I just want to add something to the remarks about the commentary on the guy that Francis was good. Stroumsa had a commentary on the guy, and that he transformed into his introduction, so that one doesn't need the commentary necessarily, but he made use of it for the introduction. The only way I know that, well, I forget exactly what he said, but at one point he was really good from Ivry he would give the commentary. I unfortunately never pressed the point, and I assume it's somewhere in the library. I had no idea. Also, I figured that he had everything he really wanted to say in the introduction, in his introduction. It also bears incidentally on this question of whether a close commentary is needed or not. You could have a close commentary that you personally write, and then you then transform into a long essay, which is a very possibility.
Yeah. But your remark about Strauss's introduction is similar to Jeff's remark about Penis's introduction, that they can be seen as commentaries on the guy, which is a very interesting way of looking at it, both of them. As far as the use of Adam for privation rather than non-existence, non-existence is more perhaps a general term. It's more easily assimilated, assimilable, is it, into general theories of absolute nothingness, whereas privation does assume, as you say, privation has a habitus to which it is the privation, and that makes it more difficult. So I think for that reason he preferred non-existence to make the point stronger than perhaps less ambiguous. But Maimonides wanted to be more equivocal about it. Penis felt perhaps he didn't. He wanted to be more clever to the unsuspecting reader. I wanted to also comment on the Naya tradition. The use of it as providence does go back to the late Greek tradition, but it's used by all the philosophers in a personal way. This impersonal force coming from the one is somehow given a sense of consciousness, so that Avicenna and others, they use it already in a way similar to Maimonides. So he wasn't unique in personalizing providence. I think it was a device used by all the philosophers to keep the critics at bay and the unsuspecting readers. Whether we should keep them at bay still is the question that Sarah raises.
I just wanted to add another point. I think to your question about Adam. It's regularly used Greek translation of Aristotle to translate spheresis, which is always translated as something like privatio, and not privation. So privation is really the first term that comes to mind. In the passages Alfred has, it really seems that privation might not work that well. And non-existence or non-being might work better. And the influence of Greek pronoia amongst early Greek commentators, particularly those one would not expect to use it, like Alexander, is really quite puzzling. And
kind of in opposition to the Stoics, so is that right? Alexander had to come to grips with the Stoics were saying.
I want to venture to respond to your question about Hudus and creation and time. I mean, it's not really a response, but just perhaps a piece of information. When I was writing my dissertation on Mukamas, the word Hudus and all the derivatives of Hadatha appear lots of time. And Pinus, so I was translating it into Hebrew, and Pinus actually corrected me every time I translated Hudus as Bri'ah or Bara. He would translate it Bara Bazman in Hebrew, which is, since then I came to think of created in time as a good English translation, but in Hebrew it sounded terrible. And he insisted that I should add every time Nivra Bazman, which at the end I didn't because it does sound terrible. And the explanation was that the word Nivra translates Chalik, which everyone can use whatever this person thinks. And it doesn't tell you anything about whether it's created when the concept of time, that is, of a matter on which time works, is already there, or whether it's a camouflage for an Aristotelian or Platonic or something. So he actually thought of adding this to distinguish it from Mubdi or Khalik. Mubdi, which he identified as something that is not creation in time, and Khalik, which is passepartout for everything. So I assume that this applies also to the guide.
There are questions on this.
This is addressed to all the panelists. In your formal remarks, you were addressing the question of the fidelity and adequacy of Pinus's translation of the Judeo-Arabic. Do you have any observations to make or share about the adequacy of the Judeo-Arabic text that Pinus simply took for granted? Let's say he took what Joel had, he took what Munk has, and in the absence of a truly scientific critical edition, there may be one now, I don't know, they're the promise of the text that he had. There must be, this is pure fantasy on my part, there must be 100 fragments of greater or lesser extent floating around somewhere of the Judeo-Arabic. Maybe it's 1,000, who knows?
Well, there is, as Zach mentioned, there is the published edition of the autographs by Sira and
Silvi Di Donato.
And Silvi Di Donato, yeah. Colette Sira and Silvi Di Donato published the autographs. But I think, obviously you're raising a very important question. I think the task is so daunting because we don't have the autographs for everything. Autographs that we have are not necessarily Maimonides' own last word on this text. Then there is a tradition that may well be reflected in the text that even Tibon had, and we don't have an edition of that, a critical edition of that either. But yes, once we have this critical edition of the guide, the Judeo-Arabic, which takes account of even Tibon, then I think it would be good to look again into the English translation.
But it's a good thing Pinus didn't wait for it.
It would be a good thing to wait.
It's a good thing Pinus didn't wait for it.
Well, that's another issue.
Yes, if you spoke about this, Professor Harvey, because I came in a few minutes late, I apologize. But I wanted, since this is a conference about the translation, I also wanted to give some cover to Friedlander's translation, which I always thought was very fine. And one of the questions I have, and I would address it to you, when people criticize Friedlander's translation, I never hear them taking into account his fine notes. And that may very well be because they don't have them. They were only published once, and they weren't published after that for financial and commercial reasons, which, as we know. And so we get that horrible edition that is everywhere, very hard to read. But his original edition, where they pressed the 3 volumes together into 1 volume and didn't change the pages, so that for volume 1 it goes from 1 to whatever, and then volume 2 it goes from 1 to whatever. You have a set of notes, and his notes are very extensive, and they discuss translational difficulties, among other things. They're not like Schwartz's notes, depending so much on current scholarly essays, although there are always some references to German articles which you'll never find anywhere. In and of itself, it seems to me that Friedlander's notes don't need an update. They read very, very nicely even today. When people criticize his eminently readable and scholarly translation, do you think it would change their opinion if they took his notes into account?
Well, Professor Harvey is giving a talk on that tomorrow. And he has some ideas precisely on that question. But Professor Harvey also has another question.
Hold on.
I have it's true, I will talk about Friedlander tomorrow, and I agree that his notes are excellent notes and deserve to be read carefully. But I have a question. I want to revisit Joseph Stern's comment to Alfred, which I think is something also that is very curious for me too. Joseph said with regard to Inaya, and where Venus introduces watching over. In Venus's introduction and in everything else he wrote, he's very careful to stress the natural nature of providence, and he never introduces supernatural providence. And therefore, Joseph is right to be surprised, and I was surprised that Venus puts in watching over when he could have had preserve or provide, which would have been less anthropomorphic. He purposely goes for this anthropomorphic term. And he does it in the other examples you gave too. Venus was the one who wrote the articles showing that Maimonides was a determinist and was not a libertarian. Why then does he say choose freely instead of choose, the ikhtiyar? Who's forcing him to add freely? And the other example, Venus also shows that eternity means immortality means the immortality of the active intellect, not the immortality of the human person. Venus wrote about that more than anybody. Why then does he all of a sudden say he survives and not it survives? These are all kinds of changes that we would expect other authors, I don't want to say Friedlander, we would expect other authors to put in if they want to give a more traditional, create a more traditional Maimonides, as Jeff indicated. But this is not what Venus writes neither in his introduction or other places. Why is he putting all these? And by the way, the he. There are other examples. I noticed other examples where Venus puts in he when you would have expected it. Many times he puts in this he. And it's very puzzling that he's going in this anthropomorphic direction, which seems to be systematic.
Are you going to give the answer tomorrow?
No, I'm talking about Friedlander tomorrow. Friedlander is very happy with it. Friedlander would be very, very happy because he likes to give a more traditional Maimonides. But had Friedlander made these changes, I would have understood it. But Friedlander doesn't. Friedlander says it. Friedlander just says chooses. I mean, Friedlander is okay on these issues. It's Venus who's doing it, which is very strange. Do you have any idea why he's...
Do I tried to explain it in the paper that he felt a kind of responsibility to the Rambam to present things the way a reader of the original could have understood it. He could have understood it the other way, as Richard said. with a sophisticated background. But many readers, as he knows, would have read it. He says he's writing just for the one person on 10,000, but he knew that it would be read by many others, by the rabbinical cadre of leadership, and that they were not prepared for the radical views. So he threw them the bone of giving them what he thought they could accept. And Venus felt, perhaps, that the community is still not ready for any more enlightenment, and also, which it isn't to this day, of course. He was right in that respect. And he also felt obliged, as following Strauss, to keep faith with the author, or with the medieval tradition in which they grew up. And that's why he preferred to present his picture as he did. That's why I take on it. That's all conjecture, of course.
That is a fair assessment if you're translating a book more or less at the same period it was written, when the people have the same intellectual outlook, the same mentality, and the same language. But that is not true of a book which was written 800 years before, in a different context, in a different civilization. I think that it's a great shame, indeed even an injustice, if we take into account the rabbinical adage, Al timna halacha mitalmid, that Pinus did not write a commentary. He who had an extraordinary grasp of all the aspects of both Islamic and Jewish philosophy did not immortalize or bring nearer to the modern reader some of his insights into what would have been the influences, the philosophical influences of Maimonides. Instead of that, and I think this is a decoy, this is a fog, to say that financial considerations impeded this project, because in fact, what is the introduction? I think it's something like 150 pages. Those 150 pages, extra pages, could have been embedded as a sort of running commentary, which is not an interpretive commentary, but just a clarification of the context. And
why
I
would
think
that
it's
be
a
better
very
than having it as an introduction?
Because it would help the reader step by step as he's reading the book to take into account the philological implications that are behind the English text in the original Arabic, and would help him understand certain concepts without referring back or having in mind the introduction. This would be on the spot, as did Munch, and to a certain extent Friedlander, only that with the difference, differently to Friedlander, both Munch and Pinus were philosophers. I think that Friedlander was principally a philologist, but they had the philosophical background. But let us bear in mind, they are 100 years apart. How many Arabic texts had been edited and made available in that period that could have been helpful for us understanding of the book in the 20th and 21st century?
The best comment was the one Wilson never wrote.
I just want to perhaps sharpen a little bit something that you, Alfred, said, and I think you said two things together, and as far as I see them, there are two different things. One is to say Pinus did that because the public is not ready, and the other is to say Pinus did it because he thought that Maimonides, this is the way Maimonides addressed his readership. And I think that these are two things. I don't, it's not impossible, but I don't see Pinus as calculating in the pedagogic way to the audience who is or is not ready for a certain truth. I don't think he was afraid to shock in that way. but I can see very well him trying to figure out the way to actually to emulate the way Maimonides was addressing his audience. I think these are two different explanations.
Yes, it's very possible, you're right. I think there was an influence here of Leo Strauss on Venus, and that may have prevailed in his translation too.
How would that have prevailed? In what sense?
Because, as was pointed out, Leo Strauss had an attitude to preserve a certain mystique, a medieval approach, pre-enlightenment views that one needed to subscribe to all current ideas post-enlightenment, and there's no need to burden the translation with too much explanation for that. Let the readers struggle for it and keep it of that genre of difficult political texts to which Strauss was favored, was partial. And Venus was prepared, perhaps that was the agreement he made to go along with it. So though I agree with you saying that he wasn't one to be afraid of popular opinion, he wasn't, in this case, he wasn't acting fully as his own person. He was acting for commission, and he didn't necessarily disagree with doing it the way Strauss would have wanted it.
It is a bit after 5, and I didn't see from my vantage point that others had questions. Is that right? The last question. Okay, I want to thank our 3 panelists and all of you for this really engaging and thoughtful discussion.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.